This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development and the potential for aggressive play. This move mirrors white's central pawn advance, immediately contesting control of the d4 and e5 squares and opening lines for the queen and bishop, setting up classical open games. This move develops a minor piece towards the center, attacking black's central pawn and preparing for kingside castling. This move develops a piece towards the center, contesting white's knight and preparing to support the d-pawn, a common response in many classical openings like the Ruy-Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Ruy-Lopez, a highly strategic opening where white aims to exert long-term pressure by targeting black's knight, and potentially creating pawn structure weaknesses later in the game. This move, 3, f5, directly challenges white's strong bishop on b5 and enters the Samish variation of the Ruy-Lopez, aiming to seize the initiative by disrupting white's central control and opening lines for black's pieces. This move enters the Riga variation of the Ruy-Lopez, a sharp and complex opening where white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses. This move, 4, nd4, abandons the standard development of the Ruy-Lopez and instead seeks to immediately challenge white's bishop on b5 and disrupt white's central control. White retreats the bishop to a safer square, preparing to recapture on f5 if black exchanges on d4 and avoids an immediate pawn weakness. This move develops the knight to its most active square, challenging white's bishop and preparing to castle kingside while also potentially disrupting white's pawn structure by threatening the e4 pawn. Capturing the pawn on f5 opens the e-file for white's rook and challenges black's aggressive pawn push, aiming to exploit weaknesses in the king's defense. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating potential central pawn advances and aiming to control key squares. Castling kingside solidifies the king and prepares to bring the remaining rook into play, aiming to resolve the tension created by black's aggressive pawn push on move 3. Castling now secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental defensive and offensive principle after the opening phase. This move exploits black's ambitious and somewhat reckless pawn push with f5, allowing white to gain a tempo and centralize the knight while potentially creating tactical opportunities against black's king. This move aims to disrupt white's central advantage and open lines for black's pieces, particularly targeting the weakened e5 pawn. This move re-centers the knight, preparing to recapture the pawn on e5 and maintaining pressure on black's central pawn. This move recaptures the pawn and develops the bishop, creating pressure along the b1h7 diagonal while preparing to contest control of the center. This exchange resolves tension in the center and allows white to simplify, potentially entering an endgame where the knight might be more active than black's undeveloped bishop. Black recaptures the pawn, maintaining material equality and developing the bishop to an active square on the d4 diagonal, now targeting white's central pawn on e4. This move, Knight2, prepares to reposition the knight to a more active square, likely f4 or g3, to support the kingside attack or control central squares, while also unpinning the f3 pawn should black advance their pawn to e4. This move directly attacks the white knight on f3, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially gain an advantage by forcing a recapture or a knight repositioning. This move aims to gain space and support the knight on e2, while also preparing to challenge black's bishop on g4 and improve white's pawn structure. This move prepares to castle queenside, aiming to activate the queen and connect the rooks, while also supporting the central pawn structure and potentially challenging white's knight on e2. The bishop retreats to b5, aiming to maintain the tension on the c6 knight and prepare for potential pawn advances or peace exchanges on the queenside. This move sacrifices the bishop for a pawn and knight, disrupting white's pawn structure and opening lines towards the white king in a tactical exchange. This rook sacrifice on f2, while seemingly audacious, aims to disrupt black's king's safety and break open lines for white's remaining pieces. A common theme when facing an early king castling and a bold pawn advance like black's f5. This move offers a dynamic exchange, trading a bishop for a pawn and rook, which will open up the queenside for white's rook and potentially create attacking chances on the d-file. This move initiates pressure on the d5 pawn and simultaneously aims to disrupt black's defensive structure by creating threats on the queenside. This move forces white's bishop to retreat, preventing the immediate recapture of the pawn on c3 and disrupting white's coordination. This move prepares to defend against the immediate threat of the bishop on f2 and potentially aims to gain space on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, targeting white's queenside and preparing to redeploy to a more central square if the opportunity arises, while also increasing pressure on the d4 pawn. This move, ing3, aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or reinforcing the e4 pawn if it were to come under pressure. Capturing on b5 opens the a-file and forces white to recapture with the queen, potentially disrupting its coordination and creating targets on the queenside. This move shores up the e4 pawn, preventing immediate tactical threats and creating a more solid central pawn structure for white, while aiming to develop the queenside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square on the d6 diagonal, aiming to coordinate with the bishop and potentially pressure white's central pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing black's center and potentially preparing for further piece activity. The queen returns to d7 to defend the knight on f3 and prepare for further action on the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn advance or repositioning itself to a more active square. This move sacrifices the bishop to win a pawn and disrupt black's coordination, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to recapture the pawn on c7, forcing white to address the immediate tactical threat. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, threatening the vulnerable knight on g6 and preparing to challenge black's control of the d-file. The move ***** boldly challenges the white queen and knight, seeking to disrupt white's coordinated attack and potentially create tactical opportunities by exploiting the undefended f2 pawn. This exchange simplifies the position, eliminating a key attacking piece for white and freeing up the black rook to potentially become more active on the open d-file. This is a forced exchange on f8, simplifying the position and accepting the loss of material in return for freeing up the rook from the back rank. This move repositions the rook to the open file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially launch an attack on the queenside or center. After further piece development, this move unpins the knight on g3, allowing it to potentially rejoin the attack or defend, but it also offers white a strong central pawn push with d5 in the near future, creating a central pawn majority. This move recaptures the bishop and strengthens white's central control while opening the e-file for potential king attack in this complex, open position. The king tucks away on the rook file, aiming to escape the direct pressure along the center and prepare for potential counterplay on the queen side or by bringing the king into the action later. This move reiterates pressure on the a6 pawn, forcing black to defend again and potentially allowing white to improve their piece coordination. This move reactivates the rook, preparing to contest the open file and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside. This move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open the queenside for white's rook and queen. This pawn capture opens the b-file, creating immediate tactical threats and forcing black to defend against potential queen and rook infiltration. Capturing the pawn on b7 creates an immediate threat to black's queenside pawns and the rook on a8, forcing black to defend reactively. This move creates a vital defensive pawn shield for the king, preventing potential checks along the h4-d8 diagonal and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside later in the game. This move aims to exploit the undefended a-pawn, forcing black to address the immediate threat and potentially disrupting their pawn structure. This move, 28, b4, allows white to capture the bishop with 29, qx b7, simplifying the position and creating a passed pawn on the a-file. This move opens the c-file, creating active counterplay for white's rooks and queens along the newly liberated diagonal, while also contesting black's control of the queenside. This move repositions the king to a safer square, away from the potentially dangerous queen and bishop battery on the a6-f1 diagonal, while also preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. The pawn push c5 attacks black's queen and creates a passed pawn on the c-file, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside. This move brings the rook to the f-file, challenging white's control and potentially preparing to contest it, while also keeping an eye on the central squares. This move is a strategic retreat of the queen to a more active square, intending to reposition it to support the d5 pawn advance and potentially challenge black's control of the central squares. This move redirects the rook to the open g-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially create counterplay against the weakened kingside. This move aims to centralize the king and prepare for potential kingside activity or to avoid checks on the back rank, while also ensuring the king isn't trapped on the h-file. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to create threats against white's kingside and potentially exploit the open nature of the position, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances or piece repositioning. This move aims to redeploy the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a central pawn push or preparing for further exchanges while maintaining pressure on black's kingside. The move h5 aims to create attacking chances on the kingside by gaining space and potentially opening lines against white's king, while also preparing further pawn advances or piece maneuvering. This rook move aims to connect the rooks and potentially prepare for central pawn advances or an attack on the queenside, while defending the kingside implicitly. This move places the queen on a more active square, eyeing white's queenside and potentially preparing to coordinate with the rook on the b-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the d-pawn's advance while simultaneously creating threats against black's queen and potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. This move introduces a strong tactical threat to white's queenside pawns, forcing white to defend and potentially revealing weaknesses in their pawn structure. This rook move aims to redeploy the rook to a more active file or support a pawn advance, while also potentially defending the king if black can create threats on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, targeting the vulnerable a2 pawn and potentially creating threats along the second rank after White's bishop is no longer defending it. This move aims to centralize the queen, increasing its influence and preparing for potential attacks on the kingside or supporting advances in the center. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the d6 pawn and potentially supporting a pawn push on the kingside or creating threats against White's queenside pawns. This move activates the queen to attack the g3 pawn and simultaneously prepares to exchange queens, which would simplify the position in Black's favor given their more active pieces. This move sacrifices the rook to achieve a mating attack and exploit White's exposed king, aiming to create decisive complications in the center and on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses on the kingside and creating threats against Black's vulnerable pawn structure. This move seeks to activate the queen on a more active diagonal, anticipating further exchanges and aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure with potential threats on the kingside. This move aims to exchange the queens, simplifying into an endgame where White's better pawn structure might offer an advantage. The pawn push on the h-file aims to create space and potential mating threats on the kingside by unpinning the g-pawn and opening a diagonal for the queen, while also potentially attacking the bishop on g5. This move creates a dangerous passed pawn on c6, aiming to disrupt Black's kingside defenses and open lines for White's queen.